Hi, Heather. Hello, everybody, and welcome
Joe.
to the lab. We're waiting for some folks to start to trickle into the room. For those of you that haven't attended a lab before, we do these on the last Thursday of every month. These are all predominantly questions that come in from folks that sign up, that you all that signed up that sent questions, so thank you. As the rules of the lab, we're going to go through a presentation. We'll have a section of question and answers after Heather's presentation. My colleague Kate Ryba will field those questions and basically guide us through a question and answer period after Heather's talk. Before we get to Heather, I want to just get through a couple of the questions that were sent in and just try to address them that were outside of Heather's expertise. And in the case of this one's outside of my expertise too, but how do you improve Cobb County? That's a way too open-ended a question and could be a presentation all onto itself. Cobb County, I'm assuming it's Georgia, and there is a group of folks, the Cobb County, actually Kate, if you could put it in the chat, that there's an organization that's trying to improve transit and planning in Cobb County, and I'd highly recommend talking with them. There's a series of other questions that came in sort of pairs that we could kind of align to each other and answer succinctly. So I'm gonna just go through a couple of those. One was about agricultural rights or selling agricultural rights, and there was another question about transference of development rights programs in a countywide scenario. I actually have some great stuff on that, but that was gonna be like that in itself is its own package of questions. And Kate and I talked about maybe moving that to a November talk. So I'm going to hold on to these questions and get to those because we actually have some good stuff, but it'd take a while. But one of the questions I want to leave you all with, or an answer to that question, comes actually from Design with Nature from Ian McHarg. And in that book, the book is a great book to go through. I know that I recommended it a lot. It's the basis of GIS, the basis of the work that we do at Urban 3. But there's this great quote of his, which is, "A man on the moon will know the price of a gallon of oxygen." So if you think about that, what would you pay for a gallon of oxygen if you were on the moon? And we should look at our landscape of our agricultural and fertile soils the same way. What would we pay to have that fertile soil to grow crops in the future if we don't have it? And when you put a strip mall or a subdivision on that farm, that's the last time you get to farm it. So there's a cost to that, and we should talk about it. And finally, before I turn it over to Heather, there's a second pair of questions that I can get to pretty quickly around towns. So this question was in the context of a country town. At what point do you start to develop a code when big box stores come in and you're starting to lose your walkability? The short answer is you start yesterday. You should always start to look at your code and make sure that it facilitates the stuff that grows you well and discourages the stuff that actually drives you broke. And another pairing with that is what lessons can smaller towns learn from our work, thinking about populations of cities 5,000 and smaller with no municipal and water system. So a good lesson for both of those. That pair is Brevard, North Carolina, which is a town of 7,500 people. It's like Mayberry. It hasn't changed much in a long time. It looks just like this postcard. The mayor's name is Mayor Jimmy. He's been mayor for close to 30 years, and he's super awesome. We did their model, and you can see where downtown is. So even in small places, if you have some level of built up core, I think the tallest building in their city is 3 stories, you're going to see the potency based off of density and traditional patterns versus sprawl. Now, on the flip side, we did a project in another town, a town called Cary. And what's fascinating to us is Cary is 168,000 people, and they call themselves a town. They're outside of Raleigh, so this is Wake County, home to Raleigh, and this is the Cary part of it. So this is it. You know, this is a place where they've called themselves a town, they considered themselves rural, and they basically just developed into something. And this is about how potent their downtown is. So it's about 2% land area and less than 2% value. So it's actually a 1 to less than 1 ratio of value to area. That's not good. Again, back to Brevard and my town of Asheville, we're at about a 1 to 7 and 1 to 6 in Brevard and Asheville respectively versus their less than 1 to 1. that has huge value implications on potency. It also undermines your ability to grow that revenue. So in Asheville's case, we fund a lot of our city off the potency of our downtown. That's your golden goose. Now you have to feed that golden goose. You can't just take all the money out of it. Now to show you how it means, or what it means from a different standpoint, this is just putting the three cities side by side. And one of the things that's kind of notable here, oops, sorry about that. One of the things that's notable here is that Brevard has 5% of the population of Cary. We have half the population, but we've got close to 4 times the peak value and almost 1.5 times the total value, even though we're half the population. Brevard at 5% of the population is achieving 30% of the peak value, the top of the model of Cary. So Cary has grown, 95% more, 9 times more than Brevard, more than 9, and I guess 95 times. And yet Brevard is keeping up. Brevard's achieved only 4% of the total value. Asheville's got 1.5 times the total value. So this is some good statistics to kind of look at, and just also realize that this is all scalable. Cities all grow at certain sizes with certain material, and you need to make sure that you're keeping the commensurate value of your downtown. Now, one of the other ways to, back to the water system, one of the things to realize is that there's a certain amount of growth that you can do before you start getting into needs for, a septic tank can only handle so much of an area. You need so much land around you. And ultimately, there's a street that connects those two buildings. So the more street you have and the lower the taxes, that becomes a problem. In Brevard, they actually were getting onto this with their stormwater system. So we converted their tax system into a stormwater model. So here's their tax system, here's their stormwater model, and then here's the difference. So looking at the city, basically like a Jello mold sitting on top of the tax system, we can see what's punching through and what isn't. Or another way of looking at it, cutting the city like a slice of bread. This is the profile of the taxes, and this is the stormwater. Here's the difference. So you can see that the downtown is actually productive and producing a lot of stormwater runoff, but it's a hell of a lot better than out the strip, where you have a lot of stormwater runoff and very little taxes. So thinking about the cost of that, you have to package that into the way that you charge the stormwater, and that's what they're considering in the little town of Brevard, because they realize not all impervious surfaces are created equal. A parking lot doesn't pay as much as a building. And finally, to close, there's a book by Jeffrey West called Scale, and he's a physicist that talks about the genetic material of cities, and it's kind of a brilliant book. And if you think about, like he says that New York is a scaled up version of Santa Fe, Asheville is a scaled up Brevard. Your village will scale up to something, and that's the plan that you want to have going forward. So I'll close my part, and I'm going to turn it over to Heather Worthington. I met Heather through the CNU, the Congress for New Urbanism, but also Heather was one of our clients when she was at the city of Minneapolis. Heather has a 20 years of experience in leadership in government organizations, including most recently, again, working in as the director of long range planning at the city of Minneapolis, where she led her team through the creation, engagement, and adoption, and community engagement process of the Minneapolis 2040 comprehensive plan. It was fascinating to watch that process go on. I feel like we hopefully helped a little bit in the process, but it was like this fast moving train going through the system. And she's also now the founder of Worthington Advisors, which is a consultancy firm focused on governance, policy, advising, working with teams in land use and strategy guidance through all racial equity lenses. And she holds a master's in public administration from Hamline University and a BA in historic preservation from Michigan State University, MSU, and a certificate in state and local executive programs from Harvard University's Kennedy School. And finally, my most favorite, she's also a performance driver of station wagons. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather. Thank you, Heather, for your time and being part of this. I'm going to stop showing the screen. And
great, thanks, Joe.
Should be all you. Oh,
so good morning. Well, it's just afternoon here in Minnesota.
She's getting queued up. Put your questions in the question tab, and Kate will bring us through the question section at the end. But
yeah.
Take it away, Heather.
Great, thanks. So I think you need to let me share my screen.
Yeah.
There we go.
My bad.
I'm just going to walk through this presentation. It'll just help keep us on track. A bunch of you have submitted questions ahead of time, so that's what I'm going to show you right now. I'm going to try to show you.
Is it?
Great. Can you all see that? Can you see that, Joe?
It went away.
It went away. Try.
It did.
It worked in the warm-up.
All I can see is myself, which is not very interesting.
Try do Alt-Tab and see if you can flip over to your PowerPoint to turn your computer to see it, or unshare and then share back in. Try those two options. There you go. We see it now.
Great. I'll try not to do anything else here. No, I'm just kidding. So somebody said, I'd love to hear other talk about the elimination of single family zoning in Minneapolis. I'm not going to talk about that because that's not what we did. Actually, in Minneapolis, what we did was we expanded. Can you all still see it?
I'm getting a black screen.
That as a yes.
Wait, no, I'm getting a black screen. Kate, what are you getting?
Yes, it's just a black screen, so it might be your other monitor, Heather. If there is one.
It says it's paused. I don't know why.
Try hitting your space bar to advance slide, or worst case scenario, just go to full screen mode of looking at your PowerPoint rather than play show, and just walk individually through slides in your slide navigator. It's another way to handle it.
Move this window. It is pausing screen sharing.
I try hit the escape button to pop out.
I'm really sorry about this. I don't know what's going on here.
It's okay. Just pop out to whatever you did to unshare, stop sharing screen, and then go back in and just don't play the show. Just keep it open like you're looking at your PowerPoint and just go slide by slide by slide that way.
I think I know what the problem is here. Just a second.
I like your vote necklace, Heather.
Oh, well, thank you. All right, let's see if I can try this again now. Can you see that now?
No. Try unsharing and then share again.
Any luck there?
No.
No. The other thing is, Heather, I've got the same questions.
Yeah, you just don't have my slides. That's okay. People can see your screen. Okay. Why don't you just pop those questions up and we'll start walking through them. I apologize. This worked in the worked for us in our in our
pre-meeting?
pre-meeting.
Unshare and then share again. So we can see you disappear, like click on share or stop sharing and then come back in.
Yeah, it's not working for me at all, and I don't know why.
That's weird.
But I'll keep talking here because I know we're all on a fixed schedule today.
Okay.
And so again, I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you. And I will, I'll try to get my screen to come up here. Oh wait.
What's the first
Can you see
question
it
you
now?
want? I took over the screen. Let me give it back to you.
The very
Take
first
it.
one. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. You know what I'll do is I'll send you the presentation, and you can drive it for me. That's fine.
Okay. All right. Well, go ahead and start talking while you're sending that.
Yep, go ahead. So you wanted to hear me talk about the elimination of single-family zoning. I started to say that we didn't really eliminate single-family zoning. You can still build a single-family home in Minneapolis. What we did was we expanded the definition of what R1 or single-family zoning was. And what that allowed us to do was to basically allow for up to 3 units on every lot. And so that's an expansion of zoning. It's really not an elimination. And I know that for a lot of people that might be kind of splitting hairs, but I think it's important to to make sure that we understand what we're really talking about here, because I think that a lot of people think that the city of Minneapolis was interested in eliminating single-family zoning, when in fact what they were really interested in doing was building more housing and more different kinds of housing, so that the city could grow and prosper in a different way. So that's what we did in Minneapolis. Let's see here. And I think that matters, because I think that cities are going to handle this issue in different ways, and each city is going to take a slightly different approach with regard to how much density they think they can absorb on a single family lot. Now in Minneapolis, a lot is about 40 by 120. That's a decent sized lot, but it's not a huge lot. And so that's just a really quick explanation. If I can get my slide deck to work, I have a little bit more information here. So actually, I'm sending it to Kate, so you'll have it in a minute, Kate. All right, so what's the next question here?
I've got, hopefully this works, and I've got this slide up for you. So we have, the next question is, despite the changes to the law, very few new duplexes, quads have been built in Minneapolis. Why?
Yeah, this is a really tricky question. This is kind of a confluence of land use, price, market impact, and financing. So let's start with the land use piece, which I think we took care of in the 2040 plan. So from a regulatory standpoint, you can build more density on a single family lot now. Part of the challenge with building multiple units on a lot, whether you're building a new building or subdividing, or even doing something like adding an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, is finding a financing tool that will help you achieve your goal. And a lot of banks are interested in funding things up to 3 units, but more than that, a 4 unit, in Minnesota anyway, requires a commercial loan. And that tends to be an instrument that's out of reach for a lot of people. So that's part of the challenge, I think, of building quads. Duplexes tend to be actually fairly common in Minneapolis in terms of new construction. So there's quite a few lots that were part of what we would have called an R4 zoning that would allow for a 2-unit building. Now, Kate, when you get my slide deck go ahead and throw it up there because I think this is where I've got some visuals that I think will help to illustrate this. And I think part of what we saw in Minneapolis, if you look back in, let's say, the 19 teens, and you're looking at the city of Minneapolis, you're seeing a lot of what I'm going to call missing middle housing, which is what we would call it today. So these were the 3-unit, 4 kind of small apartment buildings. And there was a trend, there was a market trend, and certainly a strong market interest in that type of product, because naturally that allowed people the opportunity to rent in nice areas, in desirable areas, to purchase perhaps a duplex and have rental income from the other unit. There were a lot of different factors, the same things that people want to do today, right? And then in the 1920s and 30s, the city really stopped that natural, what I like to think of as kind of a natural market response to housing, which was those 2 and 3 and 4 unit and small apartment buildings, by zoning them out of existence, by saying we're not going to allow any kind of multifamily housing in these areas anymore. Yeah, you can go up to the, or which question are we on now? Oh yeah, here we go. Here we go. You can go to the next slide. Thanks. And so if you look at the number of housing units in a building in the city, this illustration right here, and this is a very busy map, and I apologize for that, but you know, like all good maps, it's got a ton of data behind it. But what we're seeing here is that really from kind of a time of the year built standpoint, you're seeing the highest density missing middle properties that are right around the downtown core. So the downtown core, as you might expect, has a lot of high density, tall residential buildings. And then you go out into the kind of what I would call the next ring away from downtown, and you see those missing middle products. A lot of those still are there, but many of them are part of the 15,000 units that Minneapolis lost from NOAA housing, or naturally occurring affordable housing, to market rate conversion in the last 15 years. And the reason for that, of course, is that there's still a very, very strongly desired product. So getting back to the question about why more haven't been built, I think it's really threefold issue. First, it was regulatory. We eliminated that. Second, it's a financing issue. And third, it's really a question of price in terms of the acquisition of the lot and the construction of the building. And so if you're buying a 40 by 120 lot, you're tearing down an existing structure and building new, you should anticipate spending about $100,000 on just the acquisition and tear down, or probably more like 150, and you're going to spend another 250 to 300 on the construction. So the price point is quite high for these. And a lot of people are still interested in building them, but again, it tends to be more of a luxury or market rate product. We'll go to the next question. What do I think about the statewide policy change in Oregon? So I think this is kind of I was telling Kate and Joe earlier in the week, I think this is kind of a double-edged sword for many cities. I think that it can be helpful in that it kind of alleviates some of the conflict over changing density policy at the local level. At the same time, I think some cities see it as an affront to their local control. But if you look at the sort of overriding issue around density and affordability and accessibility or attainability, really what we're talking about is a need to wholesale rethink about how we regulate and zone our cities. So in the case of some states, I think it's very desirable. You know, North Carolina has the exact opposite problem, where the state has been quite heavy-handed about local land use control, to the point where they're not allowing things like any kind of multi-unit structure on a single family lot. They're not allowing for inclusionary zoning. they're even regulating things like driveways and garages to the extent that I think locals in that state feel like there is a lot of over-regulation at the state level. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach. I think Oregon very much took this on as a statewide policy issue because some of their larger cities like Portland were really pushing this. So again, I think it's a mixed bag. I think it can be really challenging. Some cities are not ready to confront this issue. And in Minneapolis, it was an uphill battle. And we'll get into that a little bit more. I know there's a question coming up about that. So go ahead and advance. What would I like to keep in? You know, we initially suggested 4 units for every lot. I think that, I think the way I would answer this question is that this gets into a kind of nuanced conversation about how land use regulation and building codes interact. So again, we have this kind of ecosystem of rulemaking around how we plan and build our cities. And local building codes here in Minnesota haven't really kept pace with sort of this more modern idea of a walkable community where you have a certain amount of density that's driving things like transit investment. And so we initially proposed up to 4 units per residential lot, and we brought it back down to 3 for a couple of reasons. And I think this question is a good illustration of that compromise. The first reason was that when we did our fit test for a 4-unit building on those lots, we found that the resulting architecture, the building itself, did not function very well. It was a very chopped up building, primarily because it required an ADA unit, which is triggered at 4 units. And so in order to accommodate the ADA unit without building an elevator in the building, you had to put that ADA unit on the ground floor. And what that did was the other 3 units then were in each case on 2 floors. So you had this kind of odd, I don't really know what I'd call it, like a split level quad. It was a very strange solution. And that was purely a building code issue. That was not a zoning issue. A 3-unit building was a much nicer building to live in. You had 3 stacked units. These are pretty typical, these triple deckers. You see these all over the country. The ADA unit being on the ground floor with access from the rear of the lot. And so that's, part of the challenge of doing these things is to get all of your regulatory pieces to work together in concert so that you actually have a process and regulation that works. And you can move on. Thanks. This is the, as I like to jokingly say, this is the $64,000 question, not adjusted for inflation. This is, I think, really what this boils down to, and we've talked a lot about this in Minneapolis. We have talked about this endlessly at CNU and other ULI and other areas that we're all involved in professionally. Redlining really resulted in, and I'm going to ask Joe to just kind of flip through the next few slides, which are all kind of demographic data points. Redlining really resulted in the lowest home ownership rates for African American and Latino residents of our community. You can go to the next one. There's several of them here. You can just flip through. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll hold here. And what redlining did to cities was enforce a level of disparity and poverty for those populations that they have spent the last 100 years or so trying to dig out of. And the zoning laws in most cities have been an additional limitation. So redlining, I don't want to go into my whole redlining talk here. We can come back to it if you want to, but redlining was a tool that racially segregated communities. It eliminated the ability of people of color in particular from accessing mortgage instruments, and therefore, as the majority white community was building wealth through home ownership, they were left behind, and those disparities have persisted into today. And in some cases, the most durable racial disparities in our nation are related to the inability of people of color to build wealth through home ownership. So we get to today, and I think part of our challenge going forward from here is that we need to be really clear and intentional that we need to achieve investment in those communities that we're disinvested in, and we need to do that in a way that does not create displacement. And one of the most important things we wanted to look at, and we asked Kira to do this, and they looked at gentrification in Minneapolis and St. Paul. You can look for this report online. It's a really excellent study. And the reason I like this study is that it gets at the heart of this issue of gentrification, which is really, in most ways, it is a qualitative discussion. Now, we love quantitative data, and we love to dig into that and know how many people own their homes and what their income is and all of that. That's very important. But Kira went out and they interviewed people living in these communities that had experienced deep disinvestment. And they asked them why that was and how that had impacted their lives. So this is a really important study in terms of understanding this market impact of gentrification. I had one council member say, but isn't gentrification a good thing? Doesn't that mean that the market is interested in the area and is investing in it? Yes, but the problem is that most of the people living in that area are going to be subject to displacement, because as gentrification occurs, prices go up, et cetera. We all know that cycle. And so I think what we have to do is be really clear that in many cases, we're going to have to leave some money on the table as we do these investments. And some cities are really trying to address this issue through things like prioritizing budget investments. So for instance, in Minneapolis, one of the things that we hadn't done for a long, long time, in Minneapolis, we have a lot of snow. We get about, 30 to 50 inches a year is pretty average. And in our commercial areas, we have some special service districts where we'll go in and actually clean out on-street parking, clean the snow out. In North Minneapolis, which is a historic Black neighborhood, we were not doing that. And so those businesses in that area were not able to attract customer traffic. You couldn't park. The snow piles up, and then we get this freeze thaw thing, and so it becomes ice. And we had the situation in North Minneapolis where people were saying, well, why aren't we seeing retail investment in this area? Well, because we don't have a service level that will support it. And so we have lost over the last 20 years, major big box retailers. We're in danger of losing a grocery store. All of the things that make that neighborhood walkable and make it sustainable, we were losing because of a lack of investment in municipal infrastructure. So one of the things that I think is really important is that cities examine, how are you prioritizing your expenditures? How are you thinking about that through a racial equity lens and through an investment lens? And how are you measuring the disinvestment in your community over time? And I think this is a tough conversation because communities know they've disinvested, but they never did it in an upfront way. What they said was, what a Met Council chair said to me several years ago when I said, why aren't you investing in transit in the East Metro? And he said, because all of the users are in the West Metro. And I said, that's just because that's where you've built all the transit. And I think that's part of the challenge here. So let's examine where we've made investments and what the impact of those investments have been. And then let's try to flip the script here. Let's try to take a different approach with how we make investments. That may mean that some of those investments have a lower return over time, over a short period of time. But that is an important way to address the equity issue and address the deep racial disparities in our communities. So you can check out all of this on the 2040 website. I won't go into more detail. You can flip through these really quickly. This is about rental affordability in neighborhoods if you're Black or Latino. Really, really interesting diagram here. Basically, really quickly, between 2000 and 2014, if you were an African American or a Black person living in Minneapolis between 2000 and 2014, you have now no areas of the city that are affordable to you at your current income level. So we were basically contrasting income, housing affordability, cost burden of housing here. You can flip to the next one. I love this question. So I took a little editorial sort of privilege here, and here's how I want to talk about this. So this is a really tough one. I will say just up front that the city of Minneapolis, I don't want to make this about the police department, but I will say this. When I moved to the Twin Cities in the early 90s, the Minneapolis Police Department was under a DOJ oversight order. So the problems that we're seeing in Minneapolis with the police department right now, that I think are widely acknowledged, are not new problems, and it's a cultural issue. And I could put my city manager hat on and we could talk about that, but we won't. You can go into my next slide. So I think that what we're grappling with right now in the Twin Cities is that we're coming to terms with the history that is confronting us. And one piece of that history, it goes back to the 1850s and how we dealt with the native populations in this area when settlers started to move into Minnesota. So you probably remember in your history books about Dred Scott. You probably recall that that case was heard in the Supreme Court, and the court ruled that Dred Scott, even though he was living in the North with his owner at Fort Snelling here in Minnesota, that he was still enslaved, that his geographical location did not impact his suffrage. And so the land in and around the Twin Cities was basically taken through treaty in the 1830s through the 1850s. It was owned by the Ojibwe and the Dakota. And I think that's one of the pieces of history that we've started to grapple with here in Minnesota. You can go into the next slide. But I think the other challenge is this sort of, if you look at this over a timeline, this timeline of racially biased housing and land use in Minnesota. So in the 1900s, we started seeing racially restrictive covenants typically used by developers who are building more of a suburban type of housing, or how we would think of a suburban type of housing in our sort of outer ring neighborhoods. And then we adopted city zoning that basically put that into regulation and into law. Redlining in federal housing was overlapping there in the 1930s. And then the GI Bill, which I think a lot of people overlook, the GI Bill was, this is kind of an interesting little tidbit. I'm kind of a history nerd. The GI Bill was a federal law, but the feds allowed locals to implement it. And what that meant was, even though the federal law said everyone was eligible for the GI Bill, locals had the ability to deny people, and they often created a Jim Crow type of approach to the GI Bill, and especially African Americans were not allowed to receive benefits through the GI Bill. Again, that was just one more layer that created the deep disparities we see in our communities today. In 1948 in Minnesota, covenants became illegal, and then in 1968 throughout the United States. But then we were by then building the federal highway system, and the federal highway system was built, of course, based on those redlining maps. And so what we see is just this kind of layering effect of impacts, disinvestment, and deep racial disparities. You can go to the next line. So where we find ourselves today, and these, I'm sorry, this is where you've got, I think, 4 of these. There's median income by race. You can go to the next one and the next one and the next one. You could just pop through these. Poverty, and I don't know what the next one is. Attainment of more than a high school diploma. As you can see with all of these, this is today. And today, those racial disparities that stem from racially biased policy are still impacting our residents today. You can go to the next slide. This is a restriction from 1940. You can see the language that they used to describe who could not live there. these are still recorded against deeds in Minnesota. They're of course not enforceable any longer. But when they were enforceable, people actually could have their property taken from them if they tried to sell their property to a person of color. You can go to the next slide. And this is the redlining map for Minneapolis. The green and blue is the really nice areas of the city that are considered desirable. You can see that there's no mistake that our lake system, our chain of lakes system is in that area, and our very highly regarded park system. The red and yellow is considered hazardous. We'll go on to the next slide. This is our zoning map from 1927. This is where you start to see the use of single family zoning to really regulate and segregate people by race in the community. Go ahead. And that persists to today. So today, where you find racially restrictive covenants, the red, is still predominantly white, and where you find people of color, you find many fewer, if any, racial covenants. And I think that takes us to the couple of slides. Just we can skip these, but I wanted to say that I think that the way we build housing today is also an expression of how we value people based on their socioeconomic status. So this is a luxury rental apartment in Minneapolis. And the previous slide was Cedar Riverside, which is one of the very first planned communities in the United States that was intended to be, ironically, interestingly, intended to be mixed income, both market rate and affordable, but very quickly, like most of those projects in the early 1960s, turned to become entirely affordable. The reference for that piece of property is commonly in the Twin Cities, it's commonly referred to as slums in the sky. And it is, but it represents one of the most affordable, what I would call very low step in height economically for new Americans. And so there's a very large Somali population that lives at Cedar Riverside today, very rich, culturally rich and interesting population that is new to the Twin Cities in the last, say, 10 to 15 years. I think we're kind of hitting our head on time here, and I want to make sure that we have time to answer questions you might have today. And since I was the tech problem today, let's just move on to your questions, if that's okay with Joe and Kate.
Well, Kate, are there any questions that have popped in that we should talk about, or should we just go ahead and get to?
There's several questions. The first one is the questioner would like to ask Heather what she would suggest to do to start a town-wide, so the town of about 200,000 people, a town-wide public engagement and interest more people, not only residential association groups, but renters, immigrants, et cetera, if there's no interest from the politicians to get them involved in a civic engagement process. And I think she's focused on intensification and probably density of neighborhoods.
Okay. You know, I think it's really, really important, and we did this through the 2040 plan. We did very culturally specific and very intentional outreach. And so the combination of that is that you're not, I mean, I think you all understand, you're not just posting a meeting and expecting people to show up. You're actually going out, you're building relationships in those communities ahead of time. So you're reaching out to leadership, but also to people who maybe you just go and hang out in a neighborhood for an afternoon at the coffee shop, and you talk to people, you know, hopefully when COVID's over, and you're building those relationships, and then you're saying, hey, how could we engage with you? What would be meaningful for you? What would that look like? So I'll give you a couple examples. Here in the Twin Cities, we have a very large, what I'm gonna refer to as a Southeast Asian diaspora. So we have Laos, Thais, Cambodians, Hmong, and what we did was we said, okay, in the Lao community, for instance, how do they want to be engaged with? And so we went out and talked with people. We engaged with some elders and some leaders in the community. We made sure we had native speakers, made sure that we could speak their language, and that we interpreted materials for them. And then, you know, for like the Somali community, it was very important for there to be a specific leader who was part of that engagement process. For the Latino community, we did a lot of work through local radio, La Raza, because they listen to La Raza all the time. And so that was a really great way to reach them, was through their radio station. For the African American community, that I will tell you, that one was really tricky, because in Minnesota, we have a lot of people who are going to claim that space. We have the NAACP, we have the African American Leadership Forum, we have different groups who do work in different spaces. And so we had to figure out ways to engage with all of them, not just to say, oh, we checked the box, we met with ALF or we met with the NAACP. And that one was really challenging. So again, we used radio. KMOJ is our local African American Black community radio. We also did a lot of outreach through organizations like the Chamber, through business associations, so really trying to mix it up a lot. But I think the key is you can't just post a notice and expect those folks to show up, because they're too busy. They're not connected to those networks. They don't have that kind of access and agency with your organization. So agency is really about who represents me, what is their job, what is my relationship to them, what is the role that I play in this process. And so if you don't have that well defined and you feel like people in your community are not really understanding that, then you need to be really intentional.
Great.
Kate, I'm going to interrupt for a second and bring a question that we talked about before the show, which was a question of, I want to develop a socially functional neighborhood. How do you approach that? Kate, I want your comments as well about what's the social aspect of planning, and how do you develop a socially functional neighborhood?
Yeah, Kate, I'm happy to let you go first.
First of all, I feel like this is as big as the how do we fix Cobb County question.
Exactly. This is a whole other one, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, how about this? Let's append the other question, which is, what are some of the best strategies that you've found to engage policymakers that seem to be content? And the quote that they use is rest on their laurels. So for the leader that just basically wants to just kind of like ride through the system because of the controversy and complexity, how do you inspire leadership? And I want to hear the Minneapolis example, but also Kate is a former elected official. Any advice that you would have as well?
Sure. I think
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, for me, like when I joined city council, gosh, it's been 10 years ago, there were a couple of councilors who'd been on council for 25 years or longer, and were kind of coasting in that way. And what I did was, I had my issues that I was really interested in supporting in terms of creating walkable communities and new amenities in neighborhoods that didn't have them. And so I would try to appeal. Everybody has an issue. Every counselor has something that they love, some pet projects or constituency. So trying to figure out what makes them get excited. There are very few that just want to sit there and do nothing. Yeah, so trying to find that one thing and engage with them about that as an entree into being able to kind of get them to listen to you and what your priorities are as well. That was where I started as an elected official. What about you, Heather? What has been your experience?
Well, I've never been an elected official, but I've worked with them for 23 years now, and I feel like the thing that worked the best for us in Minneapolis, and I've said this several times, so you might have heard me say this before, is that we went to them very early and said, what are the values that you have in this process? What are the values that what the lens, the values that you're applying to this work? What's really important to you? And they said, well, these 6 things. And there's a slide actually in the deck. If you want to pull it up, you can look at it. And a year later, we went back to them and said, here are the goals that we think are based on the values that you said are important to you. And they said, yes, we agree with those, and we're going to add one. So there were 14 goals and 6 values. And in the end, what that did for us as staff is that every time we went back to them and we gave them an update on the comp plan and we had a conversation about here's where the work stands today, every time we did that, we reintroduced those goals and values every time. And what that did for us was it enabled us to say, you said these were the most important things. So it helps to define the work and keep the work on track. It also, though, if you're an elected official and people are kind of banging on you about, well, why do you care about complete neighborhoods, you know, or why do you care about equitable civic participation? You can say, well, it's because this is the document the council adopted. This is the work, this is what's guiding the work, and this is what our expectation is for staff. And so it was really helpful for them. I refer to it as like a tethering or anchoring kind of approach. And I think elected officials, when they have that, then they feel like, okay, I agreed to that. That's where we're headed. I think we can all get on that same page. And this saved us so many times because we did some big audacious things, yes, but a lot of what we were doing was stuff that people had talked about for years, decades in Minneapolis. You know, like thinking about development along high frequency transit lines differently, you know, but nothing had been put into code. Or thinking about, for instance, drive-throughs. People did not like drive-throughs. Everybody understood there was a climate impact to vehicles that were just sitting there, you know, running their engines, waiting for their quarter pounder with cheese. And so those are things people have talked about forever and ever, and the council wanted to move forward, but they didn't have any kind of way of moving forward. They didn't have a strategy, and that's what this afforded them.
So it basically makes an accountability and holds staff accountable to come back to those goals, which also also indirectly makes the leadership accountable, because it's like, you said this, we're bringing you solutions, here you go, and you can move forward in a way without being paralyzed.
Right. Exactly. Well, this became, it's interesting too, because I think for your viewers and listeners, this became the jumping off point then for the transportation action plan, which is arguably, I mean, I think it's a fantastic piece of work that Public Works has been doing in Minneapolis, but even a bigger impact in terms of regional thinking. So, you know, like this is where you can actually, I kind of feel like this is where you actually start to get traction on these big challenging things.
This question came in, and I feel like it's really applicable to most communities in our country and elsewhere. So I'd love to hear Heather's thoughts on it. What were the most effective strategies in your work in Minneapolis to get past middle and upper income single family neighborhoods' resistance to multifamily in the comp plan process?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I wish I could say that I felt like we really made progress. I think we made some progress, but I don't think we made all the progress that we wanted to. And an example of that is that you know, we're in a really tough situation right now with homelessness, like every American city. And the county just tried to locate a homeless shelter in a neighborhood in Minneapolis and had to withdraw because the neighborhood said absolutely not. And so I wish I could say that our work helped to change that attitude. I think that attitude is going to change slowly, but probably more because people start to see their own family members being displaced and homeless, and that's a very sad commentary on this moment we're living in right now. But I think this is where policy and compassion kind of intersect. And this is really tough because I can't remember who said this, but somebody said, I can't teach you how to care about other people. And that's really what we're talking about, is that, you know, we have this massive cost burden of housing in Minneapolis right now, close to 50%. And the cost of housing is such a prevalent policy issue that I think we're starting to feel here in Minnesota a little bit like we just don't even know how to tackle it. And I think it's largely an issue of financing and priorities. And so, you know, like that's the challenge that I think we're all facing right now. I don't think any community has cracked this code. Nobody's figuring it out yet, because it's really about a certain number of people, as you point out, who have that privilege and have that access, and they just do not want to give it up. and they want the door to close behind them so nobody else gets to come in. And I don't think they understand that ultimately the impact on them will be pretty severe in terms of how their neighborhood looks in the future, and how they're impacted by this issue themselves. I mean, we have a lot of people sitting in our public parks right now, and they don't like that either.
You had made a comment in our chat when we were going through the software about the yard signs.
Yeah.
And if you could tell the audience about that experience of how people can live in this duality of intellectual conflict in their own front yard.
Yeah, I call it progressive dissonance, because we love here in Minnesota to think of ourselves as being very politically progressive. And but we would see lawn signs, you know, for instance, the classic one is Black Lives Matter, or All Are Welcome. Those are a couple of really popular lawn signs. And then the sign right next to it, like across the carriageway, would be don't bulldoze my house, or ban the comp plan, or, you know, like they're in my deck there. There's a couple of examples, but it was just, it was, the dissonance was kind of deafening sometimes, you know. And we got, you know, we got a lot of pushback from those neighborhoods. So yeah, I don't have great answers for you on that. I wish I did. I mean, somebody said to me, if you could do one thing differently in this whole process, what would you have done? And I said, well, I would have done mandatory racial equity training for all 428,000 residents of Minneapolis. You know, that would have been great, because then we would have at least had some kind of foundation to start from. As it was, I felt like we were trying to kind of, you know, boil the ocean every time we went out and talked to people about this topic. So yeah, this is not easy stuff. It's why, and frankly, it's why people don't do it, right? I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that. That's why politicians don't want to take these issues on, because there isn't an orderly, predictable way to do this.
Well, you've talked about a lot of policies that you've done, proactive change, raising these issues forward, making them part of your comp plan process, and constantly keeping people on task and bringing solutions forward. Some incredible carrots that you've made in the process. Yet you can go into Minneapolis and find people land speculating. There's all of this need that's being exacted by other people making decisions. Yep. That needs a stick. You've put the carrots forward. Has there been discussion about sticks to discourage land speculation, to deal with capping on top of a highway because that's displaced wealth out of your community? What's going on with that stuff?
Yeah, and I mean, I left Minneapolis in early March. You know, I feel like since early March, really the conversation has been overtaken by COVID and by the murder of George Floyd. I think that those two things have kind of stopped some of that conversation. But in a weird way, I feel like it's kind of highlighted the need for those things, right? I mean, I don't think it's lost on most people that those issues have impacted people of color in very different and more damaging ways. And so it's hard to ignore the carrot stick thing right now. I'm really proud that Minneapolis has continued to move forward with implementation of the comp plan, which I think was a really challenging thing. You know, one of the first things they did was enact the single family zoning changes, but now they're moving on to some of the harder things like the transit oriented development changes that are in the comp plan. And I feel like as they get some of that under their belt, that will become more palatable for people. And if they can do a good job of showing people how these issues connect, because I think as much as the great policy and research and data collection that we do as planners, it's equally important that we think about how we're talking about these issues. So communication is really key. I can't stress that enough. And it isn't about putting things in sound bites, but it is about packaging things and thinking strategically about how we package things together. And it is thinking differently about how we engage with the public who is supportive. Because as much as the NIMBYs are difficult to deal with, the YIMBYs are really, really important. And the YIMBYs are the end the shortage more homes now purple signs there that you had up. And the YIMBYs, you know, we didn't coordinate directly with the YIMBYs in Minneapolis, but they took all the information that we were putting out there and they repackaged it and helped to advocate for it. So I do think that there are a lot of options that you have, but I think you just have to see the totality of the effort before you begin. And, you know, it's that old adage about begin with the end in mind.
So with that, we're at 2 o'clock. I want to thank you, Heather,
Chuck.
for your time. I want to thank you for everything that you do. You're an amazing person doing amazing things, and it's a pleasure to have you on here. I apologize for our software issue.
I'm sorry.
But we pulled that all together. I think it might be the GoToMeeting software.
Yeah.
But for anyone that wants to reach out to Heather, Heather's at Google Worthington Advisors, or email us and we'll get you in touch with her. Our next lab next month is so far we have Chuck booked, but we're gonna talk about and continue this conversation about inequity, racial inequity, economic inequity, classism, all the stuff that's baked into economic segregation that we see in the tax code, but also with the legacy of redlining. And we're going to focus on Kansas City and the work that both Chuck and our team has done in Kansas City. And just to close, if you need us for anything, you want to take a screenshot of this, reach out to my colleague Kate Ryba for any kind of projects that you want to work on, or any lectures or webinars. Reach out to our colleague Caitlin, and there's their emails. And thank you all for your time. Thank you, Heather.
Joe, really quick, I've placed the link to next month's webinar in the chat, so you can click. We're actually going to be using Zoom next month, so should go smoothly. So click that link and you can really easily register in about 2 seconds. Just wanted everyone to see that.
Yeah, I think Heather, we have like essentially a 800 horsepower software that we only need about 200 horses to make go. So we're flipping back over to Zoom and using it.
Nice.
But
all right, thanks everybody.
Thank you, Heather. See you, Kate. Bye, everyone.